Hi, I'm Mike Dennis, and welcome back to part 4 of my life story with a focus on my life as a professional pianist. I hope you're enjoying the series so far, and this is coming to you from where I live with my wife, right here in the beautiful downtown Panama City, Panama, and at the great town if ever there was one. And I'm seated at my piano right here, as you can see, and I will be going over elements of my life story that I think are hopefully interesting. They were certainly interesting to me. And anyway, we left off episode 3 with where I had just recorded the song Bumble Boogie, a rock and roll version of A Flight of the Bumblebee by Rimsky-Korsakov. And I just made a record of it and was selling it in the club where I was working with the band, and I had sent a copy off to Bob Orman, a record reviewer at Nashville Music Row Directory magazine. Music Row Directory it was called back then. I think it's just Music Row now. But it was a magazine that everybody looked at every month, or whenever it came out, however often it came out. They immediately opened to the middle 2 pages where all Bob Orman's record reviews were, because they wanted to see how the record was doing. Well, I sent a copy off to Bob, and not really knowing what was going to happen, but because he didn't review custom records. That's what this was. It was just a local guy went into a recording studio and cut a song and pressed up a few copies. That's all it was. It wasn't any big Warner Brothers or RCA release, anything like that. But anyway, so I sent off a copy to Bob Orman, figuring he'd never even look at it, just throw it in the wastebasket. So about, a couple of weeks later, whenever it was, I get a call. I think it was from Dwayne Dersma, the bass player who played on the record. Dwayne's a great guy, an excellent bass player, and we're now friends on Facebook, although I haven't seen him in many years, but I see what he looks like now, and he's getting old just like I am. Anyway, I think it was Dwayne who gave me a call, who said that he saw the new Music Row Directory magazine, and that Orman liked my record. And I couldn't believe it. This guy reviews all the records of all the big, the big stars, George Jones and Kenny Rogers and Alabama and all. That's who he reviews. He doesn't review guys like me, but he actually reviewed it and liked my record. Well, I hung up the phone, I jumped in my car and drove down to, I didn't even know where I was going at the time, but what I was thinking was, where can I get a copy of Music Row magazine? And I thought, well, the record companies have them. So I drive down to RCA, and I pull up in front of RCA, I fling the door open. I don't even know if I closed the door behind me. And I go running into I'm hyperventilating, right? I go running into the office, and the receptionist is there, and she says, "Yes, may I help you?" And I'm going, well, I got the Music Row, and I look over on the side where they have a little seating area for people to wait, and there's a coffee table, and the magazines are spread around in a circle on that coffee table. And I ran over and grabbed one, and on the cover was a picture of Steve Earle, who was a guitar player, singer-songwriter. I believe he's still around, but he was just coming into his own back then. And also on the front cover was a thing that said Discovery of the Month, Bumble Boogie by Mike Bunis, that was my original birth name. I changed my name to Mike Dennis a few years ago. Anyway, so I looked at it and my eyes practically came out of my head and I almost fainted right then and there. I remember my knees actually buckled when I saw that. They buckled, and I had to stand up straight to keep from collapsing. So I didn't know. I have no real memory of how I was acting at that point, but I'm sure it was ridiculous. The receptionist was probably on the verge of calling the police. But I ran out the door with the magazine, and I think took 2 copies. I ran out the door, and I ran back into my car, and I drove home, right? And I went home, and I'm completely hyperventilating now. And I read the review. I read the actual review in the center part of the magazine, and he loved the record. He absolutely loved it. And this can't be happening. That's how I felt. This was this, by the way, was September 1983, I might add, and I was still living in Nashville. I was playing at a club with the Oldham Brothers Band, these four brothers who had beautiful harmonies, and I was selling this record off stage. And I didn't think anything more would ever come of it. I just wanted to make a few bucks selling it off stage. That was my objective. And now here Bob Orman loves it and puts it on the front cover of the damn Music Row magazine, right? So, I sit there and I calm myself down. And, once I cool down, I start putting it together. And I realize that I've got something here that I can maybe parlay into something bigger than just a nice review in the magazine. So I decide I'm going to promote the record and to try to get a record deal. Now, I had no idea how to promote the record. I was not a record promoter. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get a record deal. I didn't know anything. But I could play Bumble Boogie pretty well at the time. I remember the intro was like this. And it was a really raucous piano. I remember we recorded it at Sound Control Studios. Mark Mosley was the engineer. Sound Control was this little studio over by 100 Oaks Mall, and I went in there and I told Mark I wanted to reserve a date for cutting this record, and I said, how about this coming Friday? And he said, well, I got an opening Friday, but why don't you wait till Monday? Because over the weekend we're getting a brand new Yamaha Grand in, and see what they had at the time was a Yamaha Upright, and they were getting a brand new Yamaha Grand in. You'll probably want to use that. I said, no. I want to use the Upright. I want that tinnier sound. It's got to be tinny. It can't be too beautiful. So we went in and recorded it on the Yamaha Upright, and like I said, I only had intended to sell it off stage, and I had like 500 copies pressed up, and I thought it would take me years to go through those. Well, anyway, so I decided I would try to promote the record without really knowing how to go about it. So the first thing I did was I decided to go to RCA and see if I can get Tony Brown's attention. Tony Brown was the head of RCA in Nashville at the time. And believe me when I tell you, if you were the Pope, you had to make an appointment to see Tony Brown. And even then, it would probably be weeks or months out, okay? Tony Brown was really an important guy in Nashville at that time, So I went in, and I'm figuring the receptionist is going to give me all kinds of grief. Well, Mr. Brown will be available, next March. I think he can slip you in at 7 a.m. or something like that. So I go in, and the receptionist, same receptionist now. Of course, now this is a different day. This is like the next day, and I'm dressed real nice, and I'm hoping she didn't recognize me. And she goes, yes, may I help you? And I said, I'm here to see Tony Brown. And she said, who may I say is calling? And I whipped out a copy of the magazine. I had a briefcase with me with copies of the magazine and copies of my record. And I whipped out a copy of the magazine, and I said, this is me on the cover here, Mike Bunis. So she says, one moment, please. So she whispers a few words into her headset and then says, just take that elevator right up to the top floor, and the receptionist will help you up there. So I think, okay, this is another layer of bureaucracy, but I'm still going to have to, leave my record and just forget about it. All right, so I go up to the top floor, and there's the receptionist, and I said, I'm Mike Bunis. Oh, yes, Mike. You may go right in. Mr. Brown is waiting for you. Mr. Brown is waiting for you. I mean, I don't want to keep Mr. Brown waiting, for God's sake, but, what is he doing waiting for me? I'm nobody. This guy sees the most important movie stars and big record stars and, the government people all day long. And he's waiting for me, right? So I go in, and there's Tony Brown behind his desk, and he gets up from his desk. Mike, how are you doing? And he comes over, shakes my hand, grabs my shoulder, gives me a good hearty handshake. And it's like we'd known each other all our lives, And he was very welcoming. And he said, I saw this this review in Music Row, and I've been wanting to hear this record. I hope you have a copy of it. I said, I certainly do, and I gave it to him. And he had a turntable right next to him, and he put it on the turntable, and he let it play all the way through. And he said, Mike, I love this record. He said, I am convinced that this can be a novelty hit. Now, when Tony Brown is convinced that your record can be a hit, believe me, it will be a hit, because he knows exactly how to put out a record. He's head of RCA, for Christ's sake, which is the largest record company in Nashville, maybe the largest in the country at the time, I don't know. But he was head of RCA in Nashville, and he knew how to put out a record. And if he said he's convinced your record will be a hit, you can count on it. So I said, well, Tony, that's great. I'm thinking, well, this is the end of my promotion activities, right? I mean, walk in, one audience with Tony Brown, and it's over. I got a hit record. And he said, however, there's one problem. And I said, what's that? He said, the record is not country enough. And I said, well, I have nothing I can do about that. It is sort of a rock and roll record. And he said, but he said, I've got, see, here, let me tell you, Mike, here in Nashville, I might be king shit, but back in New York, I answer to those guys in New York. I'm nothing to them. I'm just a puppet on a string. And when I go back to New York, if I tell them that I'm signing non-country artists and promoting non-country records, they're going to come down on me like nothing, and it's not going to be pleasant. And I don't want to have to answer to those guys, because they're all a bunch of bean counting assholes. All right, he said, I don't want to have to account to them for my actions. So I said, well, geez, Tony, I understand. It's not a country record, and you're in a country town, and so I did get it. So I'm thinking right now, this is what they're all going to tell me, all the record companies. It's not country enough. So I said, well, thank you for your time. I'll leave you with the record as a little souvenir of our visit. And I'm walking out the door, and he says, however, and I turn around, I'm like Lieutenant Columbo. Oh, just one more thing, sir, And so I turn around and I say, yes. And he said, if you can prove to me that this can get country radio station airplay, then I will take it to New York, and I will shove it up their asses, and we'll get us a record deal. I said, you mean just get it played on country radio stations? He said, that's right. So I thought, well, how hard can that be? So I said, okay. So I walk out the door, and I go to WSM, the number one country station in Nashville. I'm starting out at the top, right? RCA, WSM. WSM is the station that the Grand Ole Opry has heard over, and they had been recording the Grand Ole Opry every Saturday night, broadcasting it since 1925, okay? And so they were like the top country station in Nashville, and probably the top country station in the entire USA. So I go to them, and I showed them the magazine, and I got right in to see the program director. And he said, Mike, he said, I tell you right now, this record is not country. So there's nothing I can do about it. I'd love to be able to give you a break here, but I can't do it. I said, but if I can get country radio play, if I can get country airplay, Tony Brown will give me a deal on RCA. And he said, I know, but there's nothing I can do about it. We're a country radio station. We've got to, I've got people to answer to. I can't go around playing rock and roll records on a country station. So, I totally understood it. My record was out of the genre for Nashville. It really was. And so, I said, well, I understand. Thank you for your time. And I walk out the door, and as I'm halfway out the door, he says, however, and I turn around, once again, the Lieutenant Columbo routine, and he says, if you can get, and then he names the second and third largest country radio stations in Nashville. He says, if you can get them to play your station, to play your record, we'll jump on the bandwagon. And I heard, bandwagon. Holy shit, bandwagon. My record could create a bandwagon effect. And so, I'm really getting worked up here. I'm getting psyched up about this, and now I begin to see that if I got to start from the bottom, not the top, and work my way up to WSM. So I say, all right, thank you very much. I'll go see what I can do. And he said, great. So I said, I hope you'll be hearing from me soon. He said, I hope so too. So I walk out thinking, now I've got the plan in mind. Start out at the bottom, build layers of country radio stations until I get them all in line, and then I go to WSM, who will cave and jump on the bandwagon. Then I've got them all locked up, and I can go to Tony Brown, and he'll sign the deal, and the curtain will fall. Okay, so that was my plan. So I start at the bottom, and I figure there can't be anything more bottom than Vanderbilt University college radio station, right? They weren't even country, they were just a radio station. But I had to get airplay somewhere. So I'm thinking maybe they'll play the record. I go in and I go into the station. They got all the equipment around, and there's a guy standing there with his headphones, and there's a record playing. And I tell him who I am, and I show him the magazine. He said, "Oh yeah, I've seen this magazine. I've heard about this record." So I give it to him, and he says, "Let me put it on." That's okay. So he takes the other record off and puts this one on, lets it play all the way through. And it gets all the way through, and I'm anxious for him to give me his opinion. Instead of that, he leans over and says into the microphone, "And that was Mike Bunis with his latest record, Bumble Boogie." It was just played on the radio while I was standing right there. I didn't even know it, and he's playing it on the radio. So now I figured I got a record playing on the damn radio. It was just unbelievable. So I thought, well, thank you very much. He said, "We'll play this every now and then." So I said, "Great, thank you." So now I got one station. So now I go to a small country station out in Murfreesboro, which is a suburb just southeast of Nashville. It's like a bedroom community where people in Murfreesboro work in Nashville, kind of thing. And so I go out to this radio station. It's like 250 watts. It's a small station. And I talked to the guy, the program director there. I showed him the magazine. He immediately recognized it. Of course, I couldn't believe how they'd all seen this magazine. Everyone had seen this magazine. Everyone I went to, and from now on, everyone in this story, everyone will have seen the magazine. He saw the magazine, and he knew about the record. So I gave him a copy of the record, and he put it on. And he said, "Yeah," he said, "I'll add this, no problem." He'll add it right to his rotation. Now there was another guy sitting there in the studio at the time. And he got up and introduced himself, and he was program director. He was friends with this guy. He was program director for a station in North Nashville, the north side of Nashville. And he said, "Can I have a copy of it? I'd like to add it too." He said, "I think it's a great record." I said, "Yeah, of course." So I gave him I gave him a copy. Now I got two stations plus the Vanderbilt station. I got three stations, right? And so now I'm getting really excited. So now I go to. I get a couple more small country stations under my belt, and then I go to the third largest country station in Nashville. I can't remember the call letters, but I went there, and I talked to the guy, and I said, "I've got all these stations, blah blah blah," and he plays the record. He says, "Well," he said, I'd like to, and it's good that you got those country stations on it, but this is really a rock and roll record, Mike. You know that?" He said, "If you could get rock and roll stations on this record and show me that the rock and roll market will play it. You've already got a few country stations on it, but if you can show that it has crossover potential, then we will play it." Now this crossover means if a record is clearly in one genre, like mine was clearly in the rock and roll genre, but it crosses over to get airplay on the country radio stations. Not only rock and roll, but country. And so it envelops two genres and will sell, theoretically, twice as many records. This is what they're all looking for, is records with crossover potential. So, this really set off alarm bells in my mind, a crossover record. I hadn't even dreamed of it. But he said, if you go to a rock and roll radio station, like, for example, WKDF, which was a big FM rock and roll station, and try to get them to play it. And if they can play it, maybe WKDA, which was their sister station, the AM radio station. They were two different stations, but nevertheless, they were the two biggest rock and roll stations in Nashville. In fact, KDA was the #1 overall radio station in Nashville. And it was a Billboard reporting station at that, which meant it was extremely important. It reported all of the records that it played on the air 24 hours a day during the reporting period to Billboard. And then Billboard had a few stations like this around the country, key stations in key markets. And they took this data from those few stations, and they compiled their Hot 100 chart. That was the basis for their Hot 100 chart. So every week. So anyway, I thanked the guy, and I said, "I hope I'll be seeing you soon." And he said, "I hope so too." So I go to WKDF the FM radio station, rock station, and the guy, it was a custom record. The guy didn't want anything to do with it, and so he said, but if you can get KDA to play it, we'll certainly play it because they're the #1 station. So now I'm beginning to see I'm beginning to connect the dots. KDA plays it, KDF will play it, and if those two play it, I can easily go to all the rock stations in Nashville and they will all fall in line, because if the two big boys play it, they don't want to get left out in the cold, the small stations, so they'll all fall in line. Then I can go back to the third largest country station, tell him that I've got complete coverage in the rock and roll radio in Nashville. He'll play it. The second largest station will play it. WSM will play it. I will have coverage of both country and rock. I will have a crossover record, a custom record crossing over in Nashville. It had probably never been done in the whole history of Nashville. Never. A custom record by a bullshit local artist, that nobody ever heard of, on a bullshit label, and it crosses over to get complete blanket airplay coverage on both country and rock stations. And then I can go to Tony Brown and I could probably write my own deal. So I make KDF. He tells me to try KDA. So I go to KDA and I go in and I show this receptionist the book magazine and so on. And she sends me into the office of the program director. Now the KDA office program director was enormous. It was like about 800 square feet. It was just this gigantic office. You could have thrown a dance in there. And I remember that. And the guy's name was Smokey. And Smokey said, Mike, yes, I've heard about this record. I really want to hear it. Do you have a copy? And I gave it to him. And he put it on his turntable. And I thought he was going to take it off after 3 or 4 bars and say, get this shit out of here. Your custom label bullshit. But instead he let it play all the way through. And the words, and I'm quoting him directly, he said, this is nuts. And he lifts the record off. He said, this is nuts. He puts it back in the sleeve. And on his desk, he had a pile of albums about this high. And he placed it on top of that pile of albums. And he said, Mike, he said, I'd really like to add this record. I really would. But, I have to add 2 songs next week to my rotation out of this pile on my desk. And he shows me what he's got. Like it's the new Eagles, the new Michael Jackson. I mean, all these monster hit albums, are all just sitting on his desk awaiting airplay, right? And there's my little bullshit 45 on Gold Coast Records sitting on top of the pile. And he leans back and he says, what am I going to do? Like this. Shoving the ball back in my court. Now I know what this meant, and I was ready for it. Before I left the house that day, I'd stuck a $100 bill in my shirt pocket, thinking that if the moment ever arose, that I could pull this out, and I knew that money would always make the record spin. It always has, ever since the beginning of records. And so I had the $100 bill in my pocket. And now this is 1983, so $100 was a lot more than it is now. So he said, what am I going to do? He's like this. Now my initial instinct was to reach for the $100 bill and hand it to him and say, well, let's see if we can make this record play. But instead I thought about it. And I only took about 5 seconds, but my mind was really turning fast. And I thought about Rex Allen Jr. and about all the headaches that he had when he was out on the road with his band. And I figured I'm going to have to get a band together and go out on the road to support the record. And I'm going to have a manager and an agent. I'm going to probably have to have a lawyer somewhere down the road. And I'm going to maybe even have a bus, I don't know, and insurance and God knows what other, potholes are waiting for me out there. And so and then I thought about Rex Allen Jr. and all the headaches he had. He was one headache after another. I saw him in person when we were out on the road. It was just one thing after another that he had popping up, one problem after another. And I'm thinking to myself, do I really want this? And then I thought, and this was the big thing. I thought, when the record runs its course, I'm probably not going to, I may have a follow-up to it, but it's not going to go anywhere. And I will be a one-hit wonder. And what does a one-hit wonder do? Once the hit is gone, And once the thrill is gone, what do you do, baby? What do you do for an encore? How would I get work? I couldn't go and say, I'm a one-hit wonder. Can you hire me? And would I be able to get any band work, or would I have to go around on my own as the guy who had Bumble Boogie, and live off that forever, and maybe not live too well, because it's just one hit, you know. I mean, you know, I think about all the other one-hit wonders, and you know, what are they doing now? You know, I mean, and the last thing I wanted to do was to have to quit music and get a regular job. So and all this went through my head in about 5 seconds, in very fast motion. So I realized that I did not want all of that. I did not want any of it. So I said, Smokey, I understand. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you giving me a moment to play my record, and I understand your dilemma, and I won't bother you anymore. Thank you very much. We shook hands. He understood that I didn't want to come across with the money, and so I walked out the door. And that effectively was the end of my record. I never went back to Tony Brown, and it just died on the few radio stations that I had. And then that was the end of it. So, you know, then I went back to working with the Oldham brothers back at Sal's place in Antioch, which was a little area of Nashville. And we were playing, I think, 5 nights a week, 4 nights a week, and the other nights I would pick up gigs here and there. I played with Don Kelly, who I mentioned, I think, in the last episode. He's a band leader in Nashville, really good guy, great musician, and a good friend of mine. And he always used to call me up whenever his piano player, David Bird, was not able to make it that night, and you know, due to session work or one thing or another. So I played with Don quite a few times during this period. Then in November of 1983, I played at a group called, I played with Homegrown, the band that I had played with at Tommy's in the After Hours place. And we got a gig downtown at a place called Heavy's. And it was owned by the same guy, I think, that owned the Stagecoach, where Don Kelly was playing. Anyway, we played down there for about a month. And then I was the one that put it together, but then they fired me because the owner didn't want 5 musicians. He only wanted 4. So I had to go. So, you know, I didn't take that too well, but they let me go. And then during 1983 and 84, I produced I got into more producing. I got calls to produce other demos, and I did that, and I enjoyed that a lot. It was a lot of fun. And then one day in 1984, Nelson Larkin called me up. Nelson Larkin was a producer, a big-time producer. He produced John Conley and the song Rose-Colored Glasses, I think that was his. And he produced he cut a lot of hits. And so he was up the hierarchy in Nashville, in the Nashville music business. And he called me up and wanted to know if I would produce a demo for a guy that he was trying to get a record deal for, but he didn't have time to produce this demo himself. And he had heard about me from somewhere. I don't know if he'd heard any of the demos I had done, but he wanted me to produce this demo in this guy. So I said, sure, Nelson, I'd be happy to. I gave him a price, we agreed. I went in and produced the demo. I went over and gave it to him, and Nelson liked it, and he thanked me. And I thought this might be the beginning of something here. You know, I could maybe call Nelson up and ask him to come and sit in on some of his sessions, you know, just sit in and watch him work in the control room as he was producing, you know, some of his bigger artists, and you know, and others, to learn more about producing, to sort of go to school on Nelson Larkin. So that was my intention. Well, along about this is February of '84. I went back with the Oldham brothers through May of '84 at Sal's place. And we played there through May of '84, and then I think Sal's finally closed down, or I don't know what happened, but that was the end of it. Then in May of '84, I got a call from Steve Jarrell, who was a guy, had a band called the Sons of the Beach, and they played at a club called Amber 3, and he wanted to know if I wanted to join them. And I said, sure. Now, Steve Jarrell, I didn't really know Steve too well, but he played beach music. Beach music was not surfing music or anything like that. It had nothing really to do with the beach. It was music that was played along the beach resort towns in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina in the 60s. And it was mostly R&B and it was dance music, that they played in those days, and they called it beach music because that's what they heard when they went to the beach in the summertime. And that was, for some reason, that moniker just stuck, beach music, and Steve turned it into a career. Steve, by the way, is a great guy. He was a great singer and a sax player, and he was a really wonderful guy. He treated me very nicely. We got along fabulously, and he's still, he's not, I don't think he's playing anymore, but he's a disc jockey now on the radio, and he plays, of course, beach music on the radio. I think his show is called Daddy-O on the Patio or something like that. And if you look it up, you'll find him, and he's out there rocking and rolling. So anyway, I played with Steve and the Sons of the Beach. They were a horn band, by the way. They had trumpet, trombone, and sax, I believe. Trumpet, trombone, and sax. Yeah. Then guitar, bass. Yeah. Trumpet, trombone. Steve played sax. Then guitar, bass, piano, and drums. 7 pieces. And we played at the Amber 3. And we did quite well there. I enjoyed it. I was playing a lot of these R&B tunes that I remembered from my youth, but really never got into playing too much. So I had to kind of learn them. And it was a good experience for me. It was challenging. So in that respect, that gig was better than the Olden Brothers. So, I enjoyed that immensely. But now, as we got deeper into that gig, as summer turned to fall, and I saw another winter coming up in Nashville. And winters in Nashville, by the way, are really freezing cold and miserable. Snow and ice, and it's just awful. And I did not want to do another winter there. And I began to realize that I was starting to spin my wheels as a musician. Now, I knew that there was nothing else. I could have pursued producing, because I was starting to make little headway in that, and I had Nelson Larkin that I could lean on maybe for maybe a little more work, or to show me some stuff, learn from watching his sessions. That avenue was sort of opening up to me, but I wasn't sure that I wanted to be a producer. I just wasn't sure that the technical end of it was where I really wanted to be. My passion that I had was playing music, not producing it. So at that time, I decided to go in search of the warm weather, and I left town. And I headed for Fort Lauderdale. I was going to live anywhere, actually. I was going to live anywhere in the Miami-Fort Lauderdale area. I first went to Miami and looked around for some places to live. Couldn't find anything, really decent. And I really looked around for work also. And I couldn't find anything there either. So I went up to Fort Lauderdale. And I found a place to live in Fort Lauderdale that I could afford. And I started looking for work. Now, it turns out my mother, may she rest in peace, was living in Boca Raton at that time. So I was just right down the road from her, and naturally she was thrilled to death to be living in the same area code as I was, instead of thousands of miles away. So she was living there, and I got to see quite a bit of her. And I went looking for work, and it was just very tough to find. I mean, the weather might have been warm, but the work situation was not. And I finally got a call for a session one night from a guy named Greg Minnick, who was a really good guitar player living in Miami. And the session was in Miami, and I went down and played it with him, and he liked the way I played. And he said, "Listen, I got a tour coming up with an oldies rock and roll show. You want to do it? It's for a couple of weeks, through 2-3 weeks. It's an island tour in the Caribbean." I said, "Sure, yeah." So, he hired me for that, and we did that. I enjoyed that. We went to Jamaica and the Cayman Islands and a whole bunch of places, and it was very enjoyable. So after that tour was over, Greg didn't have anything else lined up, so we sort of parted ways. But we're still in touch. We're friends on Facebook, and we contact each other that way from time to time. And he's a really good guy. I've always liked him, and he's a very good guitar player. He's still playing, by the way, in Miami. So anyway, in December of 1984, I hook up with a top 40 band. Now, this is my first foray in top 40. I'm 39 years old by this point, and I'm just now getting into top 40. All the other guys in the band were much younger, and they had guitar, bass, keyboard, drums, and girl singer. You know, the standard top 40 lineup. And keyboard, when I say keyboard, by this time I was no longer playing piano, or I should say, I still had a piano, and that's what I always played. But for this band, I had a DX7, Yamaha DX7 electronic keyboard, which had a lot of different patches on it, different sounds. You could get brass and reeds and strings and so on, and which was a requirement for keyboard players in those days in top 40 bands. So I went over and auditioned with them, and they said, we like the way you play, Mike, but let me tell you, we have to play every song just like the record. That means that you have to play all your parts exactly like they are in the record, note for note. Solos, licks, background rhythms, everything, note for note. And I said, you mean we have to play the song the same way every night? He said, that's right. I said, why? He said, because the agent who books us, that's one of his requirements, is that every song has got to sound like the record. We're basically human jukeboxes. It's got to sound like the record. And so I'm thinking to myself, why bother hiring a band? Why don't you just get a jukebox and save yourself all that money? But I said, okay. So I learned the record note for note. It was laborious shit, let me tell you. Learning every little, get that solo exactly note for note. Not this, but this, and it was just terrible. And we played 3 or 4 weeks at a place called Pineapples in Islamorada, Florida, which was in the Keys, in the upper Keys. And during one of our off nights, on our off days, I took a trip down to Key West. And that was my first time in Key West. And I really loved what I saw. It was a small town, beautiful weather, very laid back kind of atmosphere, a lot of music, and every place you walked down, Duval Street was their main drag. You walk down Duval Street, every place you look in, they had live music. And so I loved the place, I filed it away for later. So anyway, I came back from Pineapples, and they wanted to play somewhere on Christmas Day, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to spend Christmas with my mother. She was right there. And so I said, I'm going to have to leave the band, fellas. I'm sorry. So they didn't think it was so terrible because they didn't like me anyway. So I left the band. And then in January of '85, I hooked up with Bobby Ruffin. Now, Bobby Ruffin was a guy who was a cousin to David Ruffin, the lead singer of the Temptations. And Bobby had been trying to break in one way or another. I think he'd sung with the Drifters at one point. And he was scuffling around looking for work. And the two of us got a little duo going, piano and vocals. I played, he sang. And I knew all the songs that he was trying to do, that he did, all of his Drifter songs and a lot of the R&B tunes, and a lot of that kind of thing. I knew a lot of those, so we clicked. And Bobby was a great guy. We hit it off, and we played a place called the Round Table in Miami, which was a place that catered to older people who wanted to come in for early bird specials. Like they come in to eat at 4 o'clock or something. And so I think we had to start playing at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, I don't know. And played for 3 hours or so, catering to the early bird crowd. And, I really liked it. It was a lot of fun. Bobby was a good guy. I enjoyed playing just me and him. It was wonderful. And then in April of '85, and that gig fell through, and Bobby was trying to get us something else, and he never was able to. So in April of '85, early April, I got a call to do a gig with a band that was backing up the Flamingos in the Boca Raton Hotel. Now the Flamingos, for those of you who are not familiar with them, they were a group from the 1950s, one of the very, very best of the doo-wop groups from the 1950s. They had some big hits. They had I Only Have Eyes for You, and Lovers Never Say Goodbye. Oh, what a song. And Cross Over the Bridge. And they had a whole string of hits in the 1950s, up to around 1960. And they were very, very popular back then. I didn't even know they were still around, but they were. And these were the original 4 guys, I found out. The original 4 Flamingos in 1984. 30 years later, they were still together. and they lived in Sarasota, and they worked around the Sarasota area from time to time. They came down to work in this Boca Raton hotel one night, and I had the extreme pleasure of backing them up. What a thrill that was to play behind the Flamingos. Anyway, so that was April. Now, you know, I began to see that I was going, and then I picked up a couple little gigs here and there with a band here and there, and I knew that I was going absolutely nowhere in South Florida. So, but I didn't know what to do, you know. I mean, I had nothing in front of me, and just, you know, desolation, really, was all it was. So, and I didn't have a girlfriend either. Now, I've avoided talking about girlfriends in this series, because I don't want it to be a kiss and tell kind of a series of videos. It's not meant to be that. So any of my old girlfriends out there, for the most part, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to bring you into this. But at this point, I did not have a girlfriend, and I did call this one former girlfriend of mine one day in April of '85. She lived in Dallas, and I called her. I was sitting around. I was very lonely, and I called her to see what she was doing. And it turns out she wasn't doing anything either. You know, she didn't have a boyfriend at the time, and she would tell me what she was working and blah blah blah. And so I said, well, you know, why don't we get together somewhere? And she said, well, that's a great idea. And where do you want to meet? And I said, well, I don't want to go to Dallas, and I don't want you to have to come to Fort Lauderdale. Pompano Beach really was where I was living, just a suburb of Fort Lauderdale. And I said, I don't want you to have to come down here. Let's meet somewhere in the middle. And then it struck me. I'd read in the paper earlier that day about the New Orleans Jazz Fest, and I picked up the paper and I saw it, and it was slated for the last weekend in April. So I said, let's go to New Orleans and let's go to the Jazz Fest the last weekend in April. And she said, that's a great idea. So we did. We met in New Orleans, and we stayed at a little hotel around the corner from Bourbon Street called the Olivier House. Now, this hotel was not a flea bag by any stretch of the imagination. They tried to pass it off as a boutique hotel, but what it was a kind of a grim little place. The rooms had black walls, if you can imagine that, black walls. I mean, I half expected to see Ozzy Osbourne leaping down from the ceiling with a bat in his mouth, but it was really a grim, gothic kind of place. You know, neither one of us were really comfortable there, so we didn't spend too much time there. We went out to Jazz Fest. It was Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, I think. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We went out Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to Jazz Fest. Had a great time. On Saturday, I got to meet Dr. John, who was playing at Jazz Fest. And Dr. John, if you'll remember from part one of this series, he was the guy who I saw on TV that night in Houston, who had played Staccalee and the Mess Around, and had made a piano sound like I'd never heard it before. Never heard it before. Dr. John spoke to me through that TV. He reached right out of the TV and grabbed me by the collar, you know, and it was because of him that I went out and relearned how to play piano. Again, I rented a piano and relearned how to play, and that led to Bob Danaher and all the rest of it. All right, but anyway, I got to meet Dr. John, and I told him the story, and he said, man, that's great. I love you, man, and he gives me a big hug. You know, and I told him I loved him, and Dr. John has always been my very favorite piano player. May he rest in peace, by the way. He just passed away a few years ago. But anyway, I got to meet Dr. John. All right, now, Sunday at Aquasco Speedway. No, Sunday of Jazz Fest, we went and we saw the Neville Brothers closed out the Jazz Fest. They closed it out, and they were fantastic. If you've never seen the Neville Brothers, I don't know, I think a couple of them have passed away now. Art, I know, may he rest in peace, is gone. But I don't know if they're still playing or whatever, but buy their records, okay? Get their music. They are fantastic. They were fantastic. Anyway, we saw them, and then we went back to the French Quarter. And the Bourbon Street, as you might imagine, Sunday following Jazz Fest, was mobbed. I mean, they were asshole to elbow, thousands of people crowded on Bourbon Street. You know, you're like this, you could hardly move. And we're walking up and down, and I'm looking for some kind of respite, you know. And I see this open door, and I look in, and it's a bar, and there's a piano in there. And there's an older lady tinkling out some kind of old tune, and there's nobody in there. There's two guys, I noticed, sitting at the piano. It's a piano bar, but there were only 2 guys sitting in there, nobody else in the whole place. So I grabbed my date and I said, come on, let's go in here. And we walk in, and they had one of these air curtains, with the air conditioner above the doorway, whoosh, so that when you walk in, you feel the air conditioning immediately. And it was really hot outside, and we walked in, and it was like a 20-degree difference, or 10-degree difference anyway, and it was very cool and very pleasant. So we said, let's go in here, let's stay here. So we went over and sat down at the piano, ordered a drink, and these 2 guys seated at the piano, they were, maybe 40 or so, and we get to talking with them, and now the older lady is tinkling out these chestnuts from the American Songbook, everything was just very drab in there, right? The place looked really nice. I mean, it looked like a fun place, but there was no fun to be had, But we were sipping our drinks. It was cool. We didn't really feel like going back outside. So we're talking to these guys. I don't remember where they were from, but, we were getting along really well, the 4 of us. No one else comes in, meanwhile. And then, we finish our drinks. We order a couple more, and the other guys order a couple more drinks. And, next thing you know, we're tapping our feet and drumming our fingers on the piano to the beat. And, now we're singing along. Next thing you know, we're all having a good time, the 4 of us, right? And this lady is playing and playing and playing, and she keeps going. This goes on for about 2 hours, and still nobody else comes into the place, right? So this goes on for about 2 hours, and the lady says, I have to get up and go to the bathroom. I'm sorry. So the guys, and we all say, no, you can't get up, and she says, no, I have to go to the bathroom. I need a break. So we say, oh, okay. So she gets up, and we're sitting there, what are we going to do now? And my date turns to me and says, well, you can do this. Why don't you do it? And now I have to point out that in each of our lives, in each one of our lives, there are maybe just a handful of moments that occur in each life that I call watershed moments, where something happens that doesn't seem like it's a big deal at the time. And because of a choice that you make at that watershed moment, your life is radically different, for the better or the worse, whatever. It's a watershed, and there's only a handful that you can identify. I've been able to identify maybe just 3, maybe 4 in my life, and this was one of them. Now, I'm not talking about, when you get married or you have your first child. I mean, those are major events, yes. I'm not talking about major events. I'm talking about watershed events that don't seem like much at the time. They seem very insignificant, very insignificant. Just an insignificant choice. Do I turn right or do I turn left? Do I want to take the shortcut or should I take the long way? Well, if you took you decide the long way, and who knows, if you'd have taken the shortcut, you might have gotten in some dreadful accident. Who knows what was awaiting you, right? But you took the long way, and because of that, everything was different. Well, my date turns to me and she says, you can do this. Why don't you get up and play? And the 2 guys that were sitting to her right, they said, what, you can play the piano? And I said, well, yeah, and now by this time, this is April 1985, right? I'm 40 years old by this time. And I haven't really played real piano the Olden Brothers I was playing that, but that was, I played with Steve Jarrell and the Sons of the Beach, but I haven't really played anything by myself in a long time. And they said, well, why don't you get up there? Come on. I said, well, I can't just get up there. I said, it's her gig. You can't just get up and do that. It's her sort of like proprietary gig. I have to ask permission. So long about this time, she comes back from her break, and they say, and the 2 guys say, hey, this guy can play the piano. Can he get up and play? And while you take a longer break? And of course, she was only too happy to take a longer break. There's nobody in there. What does she care? And so she says, yeah, go ahead. So I get up there, and I agree to do it. I really almost didn't want to do it because, those days were behind me, I felt. And but I decided to do it. Again, that decision, the seemingly innocuous decision at that time to do that. I could have done it or not done it. And at the time, I didn't think it was going to affect my life one way or the other. But I did it, and little did I know what I was in for.